fools say in their heart, there is no God. Well, the ancient psalmist probably did not mean the same thing by this statement as we would immediately presume. Now, we would assume that these are people who literally claim there is no God. That was likely an inconceivable statement to the ancient man or woman, as it was an unquestioned truth that God or gods existed. The question was, which ones did you worship and how did you worship them? Now today we do have people who assert that there is no God. An evangelist by the name of E.L. Hyde once claimed that he could prove the atheists were fools. An atheist took him up on it and said, "Oh, you don't mean to say there's no reality in Christianity?" asked Mr. Hyde. "I do, sir," said the atheist. "I have studied all phases of the subject. I've traveled, I've delivered lectures against Christianity for more than 12 years, and I'm prepared to say there's nothing in it." "You're certain there's nothing in it?" "Yes, sir, there is nothing to it." "Will you please tell me," said Mr. Hyde, "if a man who will lecture 12 years against nothing is not a fool, what in your judgment would constitute a fool?" In all fairness, we must acknowledge that atheists have legitimate complaints against religion and religious people, sadly enough. Religious people who gain worldly power almost inevitably abuse it. Religious systems have often been as oppressive or more so than any dictatorship in history. Christian people daily betray Christ in the manner of their living. And we sometimes are highly unlikable in our self-righteousness or judgmentalism. Oh, it's not surprising that some people in today's world might consider God and religion something to be fought against. It might be easier to disbelieve in God rather than to countenance the horrors done in God's name. Can't help wondering, though, what would humans be like if there actually was no God, or if they knew nothing of God? Have you ever seen The Miracle Worker? I think there's been 2 or 3 adaptations of the story. It tells about Helen Keller and the teacher who helped her out of the darkness being caused by being blind and deaf from a almost age of infancy. And yet the darkness she lived in was not really being blind or deaf. It was the fact she'd never been taught to be human, to have any form of discipline, or to be moral, kindly, or unselfish. Now, for any Star Trek fans, that was also the conclusion of Captain Picard in discussing the daughter of a Cardassian military leader. The Cardassian people had been one of great spirituality and culture until the military had taken over and controlled their society. The general was satisfied that his daughter would never go hungry, but he had neglected the fact that life is not lived by bread alone. The abuses by religious people cannot and must not ever be forgotten or treated lightly. Jesus took aim at very few specific sins, but he consistently decried judgmentalism and self-righteousness. It would be foolish in the extreme to throw out the light by which we see these sins. There cannot be a greater foolishness than to throw out the teachings which in themselves have changed human hearts for the better. I don't know what kind of world an atheist thinks would exist if people stopped believing in God. What light would we have for the darkness? What hope? What standard of behavior? There's a story that Voltaire was in the midst of an atheistic discussion with some of his friends, and he suddenly got up from his chair and shut the door into the room where his valet was because he didn't want his valet to hear about atheism. As he did so, he said it was because he didn't want his valet to cut his throat. The French author Laverdon, long known as an atheist, when confronted by the horrors of World War, made this confession: "I laughed at faith and thought myself wise. Finally my laughter became hollow and vain, for I saw France bleeding and mourning. What would become of France if her children did not believe, if her people did not pray. And when Lenin grew old and lost power in the communist regime that he'd helped establish, he also questioned his course of action, and he repented of it. He wrote, "I made a mistake. Without a doubt, an oppressed multitude had to be liberated, but our method only provoked further oppression and atrocious massacres. My living nightmare is to find myself lost in an ocean red with the blood of innumerable victims. It is too late now to alter the past, but what was needed to save Russia was 10 Francis of Assisi." Now, I've said that the ancient psalmists would not understand foolishness in terms of modern atheism. Scholars tell us that when it was written that a fool says in his heart there is no God, it was likely a poetic description of an individual who knows that the truth is that God exists, but thinks that it doesn't really matter, that it doesn't have anything to do with daily life. This is the wider spread foolishness of today's world, even amongst some people who claim the title of faith. There are few real atheists, it has seemed to me, no matter what they claim, but it is common to find people living as though God has nothing to do with everyday life. There is another perspective. Harold Kushner writes, "My grandfather was a house painter in Lithuania, eking out a modest living. He was one of God's agents on earth, maintaining literacy in a sea of ignorance and kindness in a world of cruelty." Kushner talked about how his grandfather's days, his every act became important because he believed that those actions, those daily deeds, no matter how large or small, they mattered to God. It mattered to God how he ate, how he earned his money, how he spent his money, and how he respected his wife, how he took care of his children. And it was that sense of having to live up to God's standards, Kushner said, that's what redeemed his grandfather's life from anonymity and insignificance. And Kushner affirms it can do the same for each of us. And years ago, in one of my father's churches, there was a young woman who came regularly to worship and Bible study, and yet she did nothing but raise her skepticism and jeer at the faith assertions of the people. Her particular problem had to do with the idea that maybe God should be in charge of our lives. Finally, someone asked her why she continued to be part of the church if she disbelieved so much. Her face fell. "Because," she answered, "you people have something, and I want it too." Imagine living in a way that makes people long for the light we celebrate. Amen.